My name is Warren Hafar. I am Dean of International Affairs and Director of a graduate program in International Peace and Conflict Resolution. The trip to Cuba is part of a larger effort to engage with the University of Havana and to get faculty from Arcadia going down to Havana to do joint research and to have their faculty coming up here. So it's kind of a multi-layered thing. We really do want student exchange, but we also want research. And that's what we were doing.
My name is Christopher Brown. I am an adjunct professor in the Department of Political Science, and essentially I was fortunate enough to go on the trip, and my expertise is comparative democratization. So it was sort of an interesting experience to contextualize a political system that had yet to transition toward democracy. It was clearly, there was seeds of transition available there. So.
My name's Jennifer Riggin. I'm an assistant professor in the International Studies program in the Department of Historical and Political Studies. And my interest in Cuba was mainly comparative. I'm an anthropologist and I study nationalism in the state, and I typically study an East African country called Eritrea. And I was interested in looking at Cuba for how it compares with Eritrea because they have a lot in common.
Chris, you talked about the transition that Cuba's undergoing. Where would you place that transition?
It's difficult to say. I think in a lot of the conversations that you have with different groups of people, you sort of get a different sense. The transition or the mindset of a transition is very much apparent, I think, in all groups. I think the tone of the transition will take is really sort of the context. I would, depending upon how the transition, I think, well, a lot depends on, believe it or not, U.S. elections. And the tenor of the United States elections was really a major theme among the scholars, to sort of the anticipation of how things will go. So that there's a lot of hope and there's also a lot of concern. So, but I think that sort of how these bilateral, if you will, negotiations going forward will sort of set the tone for the transition.
So there's this legacy that goes on that they're still kind of reliving some of the ideals of that revolution. But oddly still kind of reminiscing for pre-revolutionary days. So some of the things that Chris picked up on about the transition, it really seems to be at Cuba's doorstep. And that's why this was really a fascinating time to be there. From my field in peace and conflict resolution, we kind of go under the assumption that cooperation is kind of the norm, and that commonalities and things that link people are really kind of there unless they're artificially blocked. And so what we've got with Cuba is a blockade and an embargo that has stunted that country and the relations. And to see it at this time, when it's just on the cusp of coming down, is incredible. So I agree with Chris that the elections here loom large for the implications in Cuba. I give it a really short timeline to be really transformed.
I'll jump in about the relevance of the revolution also, and it was my first trip to Cuba, so Warren's been down there a couple times, and Chris, as a Latin Americanist, have a broader context than I do, but I was really struck by how palpable it was. In both lectures and more informal conversations with people, people talk about the revolution. They talk about what it gave them. They talk about the quality of education, the quality of healthcare. They talk about how proud they are. They talk about social justice and equality as really vital and vibrant and important social values. And there's also a really palpable anxiety about when Cuba opens more, which does seem inevitable in everyone's mind that will eventually happen, that will erode these revolutionary values and social justice and equality. One of the lecturers talked about, well, if Cuba opens up too quickly, there will be a tsunami, to quote his exact words about that, and suddenly there will be no more revolution, was the way he put it. So there's a really strong sense of wanting to hang on to what is Cuban and what they've produced historically, but also recognizing the need to be more open for economic reasons as well as for other reasons.
You said that you said that much of this was visible. What are some of the visible examples you could relate to people of a revolution, which we think of in abstract terms, but how do we see it?
Well, as a scholar of nationalism, I was really paying attention to the slogans on the walls, and was really fascinated by how many political slogans were on billboards and on walls, and I should have brought some of them with me. I just started jotting them down and taking pictures of them after a while. But it's everywhere. One of the first things that you notice is that there's no commercial advertising for products, or almost none in Cuba. What there is a lot of political advertising, so sort of country or death, and long live the revolution, and a lot of other sort of much more specific things about the revolution. A lot of those are obviously put up by the government, but some of them aren't. Some of them are sort of graffiti that's just kind of scrawled on the walls. So that was one thing that really struck me, is that it's very, very clear then. And I'll let you guys jump in about.
I think, Warren, when you mentioned the idea of the blockade and the embargo, you know, and when in the Cuban sense, at least from the scholars that we spoke to, those two words had completely different weighted meanings. But I mean, and I think we find ourselves sort of in the middle of thinking we can recognize that there have been some elements of it that were sort of the embargo, and then some concept of the blockade. I think for me, having lived in Miami for 6 years among many of the Miami Cubans, I think that the idea of the revolution, or undoing the revolution, was such a powerful narrative when we were there. Everyone, you know, like you said, it's right there in front of you, the revolution, the idea of the revolution, it's sort of something in progress. And I think where do we go from here is the key as far as the transition. Where do we go from here with the sense of progress? We want to maintain those elements of the social justice for the revolution, but we're clearly aware that the model needs help. And they admitted clearly that they need a new model. The question is how do we maintain those things with the revolution that were, in a sense, revolutionary without selling out. But on the other side of the Florida Straits, you have sort of the same sort of feeling of country or death, you know, and it's a completely different version of that. So sort of undoing the revolution in terms of that. And there was a very palpable fear in the Cubans in country of what would happen afterwards with the Cubans in Miami if the revolution is undone in some way, like the embargo or blockade is lifted. I think there is a concern about it being a tsunami. I'm not sure that they're prepared to manage that, and I think some of the scholars were willing to admit it, and some of the scholars were really focusing on all of the money that would be coming in, anticipating that there might not be any strings attached, somehow that the government could control that. And I think that that's sort of a wishful thinking. So.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it really is interesting to look at this slowly starting to come down. And certainly if you look at Central and Eastern Europe, if you look at kind of how those countries transitioned, anything but kind of orderly. And I think the fact that Cuba is sitting so close to the United States, and when you see it, when you fly in and you see all of the flat screen TVs being offloaded from the planes, you see a Delta jet sitting on the tarmac, and just tons of packages and money and people coming in. You just get the sense that that's the tip of the iceberg. So the idea about how to manage that transition with all of its force and all of its power, I think they're rightfully a little concerned about what the end game might look like.
So Warren, while we were in Havana, Raul Castro was in China and Vietnam. To what extent do you think those countries provide models for Cuba?
I think they're certainly searching for models. China has liberalized, and I think that the Cubans would probably, this has got to be much more up Chris's alley than mine, but certainly Cuba has kind of looked to China as not only a financial trading partner, hopefully, and they give a lot of goods and services to Cuba. Vietnam, I don't know about. I think Vietnam, from what I know about it, is liberalizing much more rapidly, and really is looking to be a major trading partner with the United States. Cuba, I think, has got much more ideological baggage with the US and Cuba, so I think there might be some differences in how that model would play out. What do you think?
I think it's clearly. I think that they're sort of open to interpretations from different perspectives on those transitions that you mentioned, the Eastern European, but particularly China and Vietnam. And I think that they're looking for a southern way of transitioning, so these southern states. There was at one point during the discussion that they actually had the notes from the last Communist Party Congress about how they were going to sort of manage the transition, and many of them were somewhat abstract concepts. They weren't, they weren't like, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. They were sort of these larger sort of less tangible goals, but clearly a lot of them touched upon, the Vietnamese, the Chinese, and sort of some of the, what struck me is the idea of marketing a brand similar to Brazil. So this sort of this Marca do Brasil concept was sort of, Cuba wants to market itself in that way, so be sort of a special thing. And these are all sort of strategies from the southern countries, the BRIC countries, let's say, to sort of to try to move forward. So those represent models, but more specifically, I think they were looking toward Vietnam, perhaps as a smaller state trying to make a transition with a much larger neighbor, perhaps nearby, sort of a regional, I hesitate to say hegemon because it's so loaded, but it's sort of a large regional neighbor with such a market there. But I'm not sure that anything can really happen without something going on with the embargo / blockade. I don't see Cuba developing as fully without it, if it hasn't in all this time, despite a lot more South-South cooperation. So, and I think that's one of the reasons why the elections are so important. And that does affect the timeline, I believe, that if Obama is to win the election, I would anticipate that Cuba would open up significantly faster. I think we'd see some more thawing going forward in the second term.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to learn a lot more about, and we didn't get much of a sense of this when we were down there, partly because of who we were talking to and partly because of who we were, is Cuba in the world. That we got a nice sense of Cuba-U.S. relations, but that's not, and that's the way we as Americans are accustomed to looking at it. But that's not the full picture. That there's a bigger picture of engagement and involvement between Cuba and Europe and Cuba and Asia. And all kinds of other affinities that Cuba has as well. So yes, the blockade / embargo is a really key issue, but it's certainly not the only issue involved. And Cuba is certainly a place that's already changing. I wondered if they want to change up to a certain point before the embargo is lifted, so that they have certain changes already in place, so that they're not swept away by this sort of tidal wave of whatever happens after the embargo ends. That they want to be a little bit more on their feet and have figured out what their brand is and figured out what their relationship with sort of the global tourism industry is, for example, or something like that.
So let's talk about that brand for a second. Was it your impression that the Cubans saw their revolution as primarily a communist revolution or as a nationalist revolution, and how are those two things connected?
So in one of the lectures, I think it was Raul Rodriguez, who was at the Center for Hemispheric Studies, talked about, was specific to talk about that revolution as being much more nationalistic. And I think he actually even used this term, that it was reactionary to what many of the things that the United States was doing. And I think that's right. And I think a lot of people would look at this idea about communism as being, even when you look at the Soviet Union, that had nothing to do with communism at all. And I think Cuba's in a much more interesting place because of the heat of the politics and its place within a much larger Cold War. So I think it all along was nationalist. And at the same time trying to balance out what the nature of the state, what it should be providing to the people. If you look at what produced that revolution, it was something very corrupt, a very different model, which was neglecting most of the people, and these are the seeds that usually produce a revolution. So I think it was nationalist, it was reactionary, and I think they've done a pretty good job in some ways of balancing this through the years, but against an embargo or a blockade, depending on who's naming it.
I think, I think we think about it in the Cold War context, and I think you're right, that things have a tendency to be sort of black and white in that Cold War context. So we look at anything that requests land reform, let's say, or any sort of reorganization of the societies, or a redistribution of wealth as being, linked to Soviet. And not to say that Che Guevara and the sort of the revolutionary sense wasn't left-leaning, but there are elements of nationalism here that I think that maybe had been ignored by the United States for focusing on this possibility for the redistribution of wealth. So much like we did in Vietnam, with Ho Chi Minh. So there wasn't, again, he being far left of center, but also a nationalist. And was there an opportunity to work with the nationalist cred and not necessarily focus on specifically the communist or socialist leaning? So I think you're right, and in terms of it being it being more nationalist, or at least partially nationalist, and then as it evolved, it became this something else. And I think part of that brand is this sense of survival. The fact that Cuba has existed this long is a sort of sense of pride. In the early days, once they realized sort of what their orientation, shifting that and sending that revolution overseas, whether it be in Africa or in other parts of Latin America, and I still think that that's a sense of that what the revolution is about. It's about exporting revolution, and that's part of the brand I think that we're focusing on, is this idea that Cuba still has a presence in the world, and it sort of has this presence of exporting a revolution. So can you make money now off exporting the revolution, instead of, so I think there's, and again, I think that there is a nationalist cubanidad that accompanies this sort of socialist, sort of revolutionary ideas.
That's interesting. I mean, I think I agree with Warren and Chris that I didn't fully appreciate before we went there that how nationalist the Cuban Revolution was, because you think Cuba, you think communism. And communism is certainly and has historically been important for Cuba as an ideology that was timely at the right time historically. It spoke to the need for social justice and the need for redistribution of wealth and the need for greater equality. So I think it was appealing for a lot of good reasons. I think it was a good fit for them at the time of, initially at the time of the revolution. And I think it also, most importantly, perhaps bought them a powerful geopolitical ally at a really critical time in history. Now it means really different things, and I think now it raises the question of do words like communism and capitalism and perhaps even democracy, are they really adequate descriptive categories these days? In a world where the geopolitics is really very different, and modes of governance are very different, and the role of global capital is very different. So they mean very different things, and yet they're still rhetorically important in places like Cuba, as they are in the United States. But how they actually function on the ground is different. So to get back to this idea of the brand, I think they do capitalize on and brand themselves as this revolutionary country. I mean, the fact that, I think we mentioned that images of Che Guevara are for sale everywhere. They have a lot more meaning for tourists, I think, than they do for Cubans themselves. But they're everywhere. That's part of what they're selling. That's part of what they're exporting. But now, if you, that's sort of that doesn't sit well with communist ideology. The idea that you're selling revolution, that you're packaging it and marketing it and selling it. So that creates all kinds of other questions and thoughts about what does that mean to have a branded revolution, a branded Che, a commoditized Che. It's a wild place where all these things are kind of clashing, and it gives us a really nice way to kind of think through stuff that's going on in other places in the world also.
I think that just to pick up on the idea of the commodification of Che, I mean, this, which is clearly the Marxist language about sort of how capitalized everything becomes. I think that that's part of the problem with the transition. There's the expectation of changing the model, but once you change the model, it's a slippery slope until you lose the revolution. And I think
that's the tsunami,
right? That's exactly why. I mean, it almost it's a sort of a short trickle that will quickly lead to that sort of wave. And I think the things that they were talking about is how do we capture these things are all elements of, undermining. Specifically, one of the recommendations they said was that it was possible now to buy private property somewhere for leisure purposes. And that struck me as so bourgeois. I mean, now we're undoing little pieces of this, which was completely fascinating to think that this is a potential model. This is where we're headed. Right. So we've gone through this great thing to sort of nationalize all these things to make it better for the people. And I think the other thing, just on a side note to that, I thought it was funny that there was a first class section on the plane. So from Miami to Havana.
Well, those are U.S. charter flights, right, coming in, so we're showing them how to do it. But I think, again, I think that oddly enough, the U.S. and Cuba are wrestling with fundamentally the same questions, but albeit coming from different sides of the spectrum. So the Cubans are trying to figure out, how to modify the safety net and all of the governmental structures that they've got in place, and to open up kind of the free market innovation and all of that stuff, efficiency. Whereas the U.S., on the other hand, is trying to figure out that balance and kind of putting in and fixing up the social net that we have. So, and I think inevitably everyone is drifting into the middle. So these terms that we've been using in political science about capitalism and communism and socialism, I mean, these are all different points on the spectrum. And just the needs of a new world economy are kind of moving us closer in. The Cubans have got to liberalize their economy, and I think it's happening. Whether or not they, yeah, I mean, it's just inevitable. I mean, the connection points around the globe that are both needed within Cuba and being imposed elsewhere just because of an integrated economy, I think force it, and it becomes exponentially faster as investment starts flowing in.
So one of the obvious places you see that is in the tourist industry. Can you talk a bit about the tourist industry in Cuba?
I'll just say that it's ripe. I mean, it has been happening for several years. The Canadians, the Norwegians, everyone has been going to Cuba, but the Americans. So I think what you're seeing is now, with opening up the policies, that more Americans are going, certainly with family and educational purposes, they're going in. And the economy in Cuba is such that it will respond to that stuff. And we actually, between the time I first went, I think it was in January in this trip, that we already saw differences in the kind of number of buildings that were being renovated and painted and all of that stuff. The interesting thing from city and regional planning view is that you're trying to address those market demands of tourism from a centralized model. So you've got someone in a ministry somewhere that is trying to decide which buildings would be renovated and in what order. So that's something that's going to have to change, I think.
But I think it's already starting to change. So in Cuba now, people who have a house can turn it into a hotel. People who or into a restaurant. And we went to a lot of these restaurants. I'm drawing a blank on what the word for them is. Paladar, yeah. And some of these are lovely, and these are beautiful houses, and they serve you wonderful food. And so this is a way in which there's and I don't know the process by which you get permission to do this, but that's a more kind of grassroots, bottom up form of sort of incremental liberalization that allows people to take advantage of the tourist industry. We saw a particular slice of the tourist industry when we were there because we weren't going to the big resorts, or at least I didn't go to any of the big sort of beachy resorts. So we saw more of the educational tourism, which I think is something that they're really willing to, that they're really trying to develop, getting student groups in and professor groups in, and I think they also have medical groups, just groups who are interested from the United States or elsewhere who want to learn more about Cuba. So that's one way that they're developing things. So, but again, that's also very state-run. It's very top-down. It's really a clashing place in a lot of ways. There's a fairly small section of Old Havana that's obviously sort of polished and renovated and shiny for the tourists, but right next to it you have a segment of Old Havana that's very much not, and looks very much like any city in the developing world. And then other sections that are kind of in between that are sort of just very Cuban, and where Cubans live and work and hang out and shop. And all of this is sort of mushed all in together. So it's not yet a place that feels like it's overrun by we heard a lot about tourism, but I never, except for in that few block segment of Old Havana, I never felt like it was overrun by tourism in any way. It's not like other places where I felt like that blocks everything else out. I felt like it was very much kind of juxtaposed with other things going on also.
I actually, in thinking about some of the improvements that they have been talking about, I saw tourism as sort of a bit of a Trojan horse in terms of that one area that you're talking about was actually really well polished and nice, and it was almost sort of some of the walkways up there was almost like this Potemkin village, because you go right on the other side of it and it's falling down, the back of the building's falling down, but the facade is nicely painted. And I think that there's some degree of tourist curiosity. Like we are on an academic trip, and we want to be more authentic. And I will say that we were able to go basically wherever and whenever we wanted, at any time, day or night, which was great. That there wasn't any weird barriers to us. That said, I think that when the tourist industry becomes slightly more mature, people are going to expect more from the industry. I think they're going to want
more polish.
They're going to want more things to do. They're going to want more things to see. They're going to want less authenticity, if you will, if that makes sense. I mean, there's a reason why Disney World is so popular. I mean, Epcot Center, people want to go and they want to experience the place, but they also want, they want the big spas, and they want these, and again, we didn't go to any of the, and if they do exist somewhere, those larger maybe European-focused resort places. But we did travel around quite a bit, and there wasn't any sort of any sort of thing for higher-end tourists or for tourists who might come with families. It would be very difficult, especially with the infrastructure, I suppose, more than anything. You know, this sort of accessibility, and in fact, one of our colleagues on the trip was on crutches. There's no accessibility. So, I mean, everywhere she went, she had difficulty getting up steps and things like that. And then, so there are some more infrastructural things. And then when you add more tourists, nicer things, you're going to need more power. So then you have to generate more power and all these other things. So there's all kinds of things. It takes money to make money in that way. So, and I think it's exponential. So there are models out there, but it's going to change the face of the revolution, I think. And then the people are going to see that. The area where there are these tourist centers and things, they're going to realize that there is a larger gap as those places get nicer and as those places expand, and particularly outside of Havana. I mean, right now that there's a presence in Havana of tourists and stuff, but outside in the countryside, there was a huge difference between the way many people lived in Havana and the areas that we saw outside the country.
So just one thing to pick up on what you said. I mean, certainly there were no restrictions at all. The other thing that struck me is really how friendly everyone was in Cuba. So I mean, this is just a feeling of almost like we were being welcomed by shopkeepers, restaurant people, just everyone. It was really a sense that that people to people, there seems to be a great admiration for Americans. And that they were very good at kind of saying, look, this is a conflict between governments. So there was this connection, and I think that was really, really very interesting. The other thing is that it seemed extremely safe. And at no single point did I feel like, you know, I was going to be robbed or mugged or anything like that. It seemed quite safe.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of police too, so you sort of feel like there's a strong presence. Yeah, what you were saying about the influence of tourism, how that shapes the way people think is really, really interesting, and being aware of how tourism makes people aware of how life is in other places, I think is really key. Anyone attached with the tourist industry can do much better than even very well-educated professionals in other fields because of the economics of it, because of the economics of the convertible currency, which is so much more valuable than the Cuban peso. So that creates some real economic bizarreness where the tourism really drives everything, and that's interesting, because then everything sort of, even if it's not a very mature industry, it really, you had the sense, and maybe this was because we were travelers, we were tourists, but you had the sense that everything's sort of pointing towards tourism. And yes, people are friendly, but in the sort of casual conversations I had, I always had the sense that people were friendly and they were open and they were welcoming, but they were also sort of feeling you out to see if you wanted a service that they could provide, and therefore have access to currency. So it's interesting. There's an interesting both social and economic dynamic that's created by that.
I think too that, just to touch upon the idea of how the models in the United States and you know, in the context of tourism, is that there's a lot of people selling homemade things, and if they sell one of these things for the convertible currency, then that's a significant increase in their household income based on how much they're allotted per month by the government. But they still have some. So in other words, if they sell their things, they can live fairly well compared to. In the United States, it's sort of that we have this sense of we have to hustle. If we don't sell our stuff, then we don't have that base safety net. So sort of we don't get that minimum level of the sort of what the revolution provides, I guess, basically in terms of foodstuffs and things like that. Not to say that anyone eats extremely well on, but at least there is some bottom, it seemed. And in the United States, we have people who are scrambling, and if they don't sell their services, if they don't do that, then there isn't really a safety net for them.
Right.
You know, they will starve in that sense. Whereas in that sense, if they do sell their things in Cuba, they can actually live pretty well. It's almost you can sort of sell a few handmade things and work your way into middle class. You know.
So that idea though about a dual currency is really interesting. So they have this. They have the Cuban convertible currency, which is pretty much paired 1-to-1 with the dollar minus a 13% exchange tax. And then they have the Cuban peso, which is kind of commonly used. So the tourists and the business people coming in are using this other currency, which but everyone else is using this incredibly devalued peso. And so what you've got is a two-tiered economy that's popping up. And I don't know how an economy can sustain that for very long at all.
References have been made several times to the embargo slash blockade. Could you talk about, Jen, maybe you can start talk about your lived experience of the embargo while you were there. What did you see? What did you...
You know, I'm not sure I can. I kept trying to figure out what the lived experience of the embargo was. I'd heard stuff about it, but I didn't actually live any of it. Maybe someone else can start talking and I'll jump in if I think of something. I know we kept sort of trying to figure out what there were shortages of and what the embargo might be blocking besides large numbers of Americans coming in. But otherwise, I didn't see it to a large degree. Everywhere we were, everything seemed to be in sort of large supply. That I didn't notice any shortages, but I'm sure they're there. But other people might have seen.
I think from a telecommunications perspective, is probably the most obvious without having those relationships. I mean, the internet was available, but you know, phones were kind of available, but I mean, it was extremely expensive to make calls, and your cell phones didn't work at all.
Now, is that the embargo, or is that government regulations?
I think
or some comments.
maybe, I guess they're sort of both of the same things, I guess, because there's no sort of agreements with Cuba, with American-based telecommunication systems, that there would be a total blackout on the island, so that there was Cuban cell phones that must have been managed through some other satellite. I guess probably Chinese satellite, but I don't know. But that was the first thing that struck me, is that the telecommunications almost total blackout from our perspective, which was nice in a way, because it forced us not to have to be on the phones and texting and things like that. But at the same time, it was a little bit strange because we live in this sort of hyper-information technology society. But the link between, I think, for their sort of idea between the embargo and the blockade is that there's a certain percentage of materials in products that are not allowed in, and I think that what is it, 10 or 20%?
10%. Yeah.
So if anything has any sort of U.S. ownership or U.S. patent technology, if it's more than 10%, then it's not allowed in. So you won't see some basic stuff there, like iPhones and things like that, just don't exist on the island. And since most of us have those sorts of phones, it's sort of that's the first thing. But a lot of their products are sort of, they're branded either Cuban or clearly something somewhat unrecognizable for us, because they would be from somewhere else. But it makes it, I think the message from them is that even things that would be manufactured in China would rely on U.S. technology. So some of the things aren't allowed to be imported into the island because of that. Or the story with the hotels, that if the Cuban nationals go to third-party countries and have hotels whose ownership is of a significant percentage of American investors, or whose headquarters happens to be in the United States, then technically they're not allowed to stay at those hotels, and they have been kicked out of them. So that's sort of it's sort of a real thing for them.
Yeah, I got more and more confused about the embargo the longer we were there. We sort of did this thing when we were there, that we would sort of look at the products that were, like the condiments that were given to us at restaurants, and say, well, that's an American company. How did that get there? And Pam, our sort of one of the trip organizers, would say, well, and then she'd go into the long explanation about why that product was okay. And so yes, there's this 10% rule, but then there's exceptions for certain agricultural products, but those are very complex. And then there's other kinds of exceptions for other kinds of products. So it's not the blockade / embargo is not straightforward. It's riddled with all kinds of complexities that I feel very confused about right now, and would love to unravel a little bit more and understand a little bit better. But also kind of riddled with all kinds of economic arrangements, and you sort of get the sense that at some point someone probably worked out a sort of favorable business arrangement and managed to get an exception to the blockade. In another case where it makes absolutely no economic sense and it's not going to hurt anyone, they do it just to kind of hurt someone and just to kind of remind the other about that, or the U.S. remind Cuba about that power. So it's a very complicated kind of political economic thing that's not as straightforward as I thought it was, and I wish I understood it better.
Right. So this is the problem of trying to isolate a country in a globalized world, right? So the lived embargo. I was only there for a few days, so I wouldn't claim to kind of be fully appreciative of its impact. But certainly as a tourist, not being able to use your credit card. So for us as a group, we actually had to take in cash everything that we needed. So when you were there, you couldn't hit an ATM machine, you couldn't do anything like that. And I think that's probably, certainly for Americans, that's got to be the biggest impediment. It would seem like building supplies were probably much scarcer than they should have been. If you had complete free flow of goods and services, probably Old Havana and some of the areas along the Malecón would have been shiny and ready for tourists, regardless of expectations. The transportation sector. So I mean, certainly one of the stereotypical images I think of Cuba is all of these 1950s American cars, because that's right. 50s and maybe the early 60s when they kind of cut this off. So all of these cars are driving around. The exteriors are beautiful for the most part, not all of them, but the interiors have been cobbled together, the mechanics, the interior stuff. And then you get these Korean cars and Chinese cars, and the public sector seem to have these Chinese buses that were few and far between, very overpacked, and prone to breakdown, I think. So I think those are the sectors, in addition to what Chris was mentioning. I think they're significantly impacted.
I think I want to sort of underscore what Warren said about how nice everybody was. And whether they had some of them clearly in the tourist sector looking for a little bit of money or whatnot from us, and maybe there was an element of that. But we had the opportunity to go sort of again wherever we wanted to, and there wasn't any sense of fear or anything like that. Or that we I think even in some areas in our own neighborhoods, we'd be a little bit more sort of on the lookout than we were in Cuba. But everybody was extremely nice, and we had the opportunity to go into people's homes, some of the different groups, and they got to see how people live, and they invited us in, and in some cases, broke bread and shared rum and things like that with some of our tour group folks. So I think that there was a genuine hospitality among the people, and a sense that really this was sort of a dispute between two governments and not really amongst peoples, that we were just all people and we were all subject to these things. So I think that as far as the feel of the island, it was extremely friendly.
I want to go back to a point that Chris made a little bit earlier, which I think is really important, and that's the idea that in a lot of ways there's two Cubas, or two Cuban nationalisms, that there's very strong nationalistic feelings among Cubans in Cuba. There's very strong nationalistic feelings among Cubans in the United States and in Miami. This strong sense of sort of death or fatherland, death or country. And yet those are not exactly the same nationalism. So then you have the Cuban state that has a lot of control still, and a very strong sense of we're going to develop a plan and follow that plan, and we're going to have control of that. So that's going to create an interesting dynamic as things open up even more, as you have the sort of, on one hand, as you have kind of the collision of these two different ideas of what it means to be Cuban, and then you have a state that's trying to kind of temper that and control that. So I think that's a really fascinating thing, and I don't know as much about the population of Cubans in the United States, but that was striking. And kind of as a counterpoint to that, I want to talk a little bit about one experience I had. I had the chance to tag along with another member of our group to go visit a Cuban doctor that he had a personal connection with, who took us to his home and was wonderfully hospitable and wonderful, and had some really interesting conversations with him. He was really a big supporter of the revolution, very much sort of in line with that sort of like Cuba's done all these wonderful things and really proud of what the revolution had done. But also talked about, he has a child in Miami, and talked about sort of having what it means to have a child outside, and his decision to not want to leave the country, and what Cuba meant to him. But what he talked about in the sense of why he stayed in Cuba wasn't the revolution, it was the sense of kind of the importance of family, the pace of life, the culture, all of those kinds of things, and the sense that, and he also made a comment that I heard in other places as well, which is that even if someone left 40 years ago, they come home and they're still family, and that's what it means to be Cuban. So you have these sort of, in one sense, these two different notions of what it means to be Cuban in these two divided communities that have been divided by the blockade and all this funny history. But then on the other hand, you have this thing that unites them, which is this really strong sense of family and this really strong sense of you belong here and we belong to each other. So that was, those two things kind of in tension with each other really struck me.
Yeah, I guess, I was struck with how friendly everyone was, and also how eager they were for things to change, certainly with the United States, and going back and seeing family that may be in Florida or New Jersey or wherever. I was incredibly impressed and continue to be with the faculty at the University of Havana. We got lectures, and on the previous trip I met with a broader range of faculty at the university, and they are an impressive bunch. So there's nothing backwater there. The university has got some great academics, they've got great students, and they are engaged, and they are studying the world. They're looking at the United States, they're following Syria, and they're following all of these things. I just think that eagerness of kind of having things kind of finally change and thaw between the United States continues to kind of impress me each time I go down there. I think that one of the things that we haven't talked about, because that was part of your question, was that struck me, and since I kind of look at things through the lens of peace and conflict resolution, this idea about operational cooperation. So at what points do we actually cooperate and have worked out an accommodation? So Jen, I think you said that it was kind of all presented very black and white at times, and a huge gray area where we do actually cooperate with, whether it's the Coast Guard or meteorology, or if there's catastrophic weather events or something, that there are points that we've always had to cooperate because of our proximity. And to see the potential, first of all, to look back and see how that has gone, and then look at how it's starting to expand, I think, again, is really interesting.